Buried in the terms of service for SpaceX's Starlink satellite internet, in a section most users scroll past without reading, there is a clause that should stop you cold. It reads, in part, that for services provided on Mars, or in transit to Mars, via Starship or other colonization spacecraft, the parties recognize Mars as a free planet and that no Earth-based government has authority or sovereignty over Martian activities. Disputes, it continues, will be settled through self-governing principles established in good faith at the time of Martian settlement. Read that again carefully. A private company, incorporated in the United States, funded in part by billions of dollars in NASA contracts, paid for by American taxpayers, has declared in a legal document that no government on Earth has authority over what happens on Mars. Not the United States government, not the United Nations, not any international body. This is not a joke. It is not an Easter egg. It is a legal assertion made by the company that is further along in the development of Mars transportation technology than any other entity on the planet. And it has been sitting in those terms of service since 2020, examined by legal scholars, challenged by space lawyers, and largely ignored by the general public. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, signed by over 100 nations, including the United States, is the foundational document of international space law. Article 2 of that treaty states that outer space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. Article 6 requires that states bear international responsibility for national activities in outer space, whether those activities are conducted by governmental agencies or by non-governmental entities. Article 8 provides that states retain jurisdiction and control over any registered space objects and any personnel thereof while in outer space or on a celestial body. In plain language, the treaty says three things. No country can own Mars. Countries are responsible for what their companies do in space, and the laws of the launching country follow its citizens to whatever celestial body they travel to. SpaceX's terms of service contradict all three principles. Legal scholars have pointed out that Clause 9 should be regarded as void under international law because a private company cannot override the treaty obligations of its home country through a terms of service agreement. That is not how law works. But the more troubling question is not whether the clause is legally valid, it is what happens in practice. The Outer Space Treaty has no enforcement mechanism. There is no space police. There is no international court with jurisdiction over Martian activities. There is no practical way for any government to project authority across 55 million kilometers of vacuum. If SpaceX builds a colony on Mars and declares that colony to be self-governing, who exactly would stop them? What court would they answer to? What sheriff would serve the warrant? The gap between what the law says and what can be enforced is the gap in which everything dangerous lives. And it gets worse when you follow the money. Musk has suggested publicly that colonists could pay for their passage to Mars through loans. The cost of a ticket, he has speculated, might be around $100,000, a sum that most people would need to finance rather than pay outright. The loan would be repaid through employment on Mars, working for the colony, which in practice means working for the company that built the colony, transported the colonist, controls the life support, and owns every piece of infrastructure that keeps the colonist alive. Multiple legal scholars and ethicists have described this financial model in stark terms. A colonist who arrives on Mars in debt to the company that transported them, in a colony governed by that same company's self-described legal framework, on a planet from which they cannot leave, and to which no external authority can extend meaningful legal protection, is a colonist with no leverage, no alternatives, and no exit. The historical parallels are uncomfortable and they are unavoidable. The company town, where workers lived in company housing, bought goods at the company store, and were paid in company scrip, was a feature of industrialization that democratic societies eventually outlawed because of the coercion inherent in the arrangement. Indentured servitude, where workers bound themselves to employers for a fixed period in exchange for passage to a new land, was a system that produced some of the most exploitative labor conditions in colonial history. The Mars colonization model, as currently described, shares structural features with both of these arrangements. The colonist depends on the company for transportation, shelter, oxygen, food, and governance. The company sets the terms. The colonist cannot leave if the terms become intolerable, and no external authority is positioned to intervene. What rights does a Mars colonist have? The right to quit? Quit and go where? The right to protest? Protest to whom? The right to leave? Leave on what spacecraft? The entire framework of labor rights, civil rights, and human rights that democratic societies have constructed over centuries depends on one fundamental assumption: that the individual has alternatives, that they can leave, that they can appeal to a higher authority, that they can, at the very last resort, walk away. On Mars, there is nowhere to walk to. The question of governance becomes even more complex if a colony grows. If it achieves something approaching self-sufficiency over decades, at what point do its inhabitants have the right to self-determination? A 2025 paper published in the journal Space Policy proposed treating Mars as a sovereign juridical peer to Earth, a political entity with its own legal standing, independent of the nations or companies that established the initial settlement. Legal scholars have examined whether Martian colonists could eventually constitute a people with rights to self-governance under international law. The answer is uncertain and deeply contested. International law does recognize the right of peoples to self-determination, but the definition of a people and the conditions under which that right can be exercised are among the most contentious questions in international jurisprudence. Would a few hundred colonists, transplanted by a private company, qualify? Would they need to reach a certain population threshold? Would they need to demonstrate political coherence? Would the company that established the colony voluntarily cede power? Is less than #0. 5# is greater than. History offers no comforting precedents. Colonial powers have never voluntarily given up territory without struggle. Companies have never voluntarily surrendered authority over populations that they control. The path from colony to self-governing entity has, in virtually every historical case, passed through conflict. And the power asymmetry between a Mars colony and the Earth-based entity that supplies it with technology, replacement parts, and potentially new colonists would be unlike any power asymmetry in the history of human governance. The colony cannot survive without supply ships from Earth. The company controls the supply ships. The relationship is not between equals. It is between a population trapped in a sealed habitat on a lethal world and the entity that decides whether the next shipment arrives. There is something deeply strange about the fact that the governance framework for the first extraterrestrial human settlement is being drafted not in the halls of the United Nations, but in the terms of service of a satellite internet provider. That the political future of Mars is being shaped not by political philosophers or constitutional scholars or the people who will actually live there, but by a corporate legal team in Hawthorne, California. Is Mars colonization, as currently architected, freedom? Or is it the creation of a new kind of captivity, dressed in the language of exploration? The answer to that question depends entirely on who gets to write the rules. And right now, the people who will live under those rules have not been consulted. They have not been asked. Many of them have not yet been born. The decisions being made today, in boardrooms and legal departments and engineering meetings, will determine the political reality of a world that no living human has ever touched. And those decisions are being made with remarkably little scrutiny, remarkably little public debate, and remarkably little concern for the historical patterns that should be flashing warning lights in every direction. But the legal questions, as urgent as they are, may not be the most important questions about Mars. Because while we debate who owns the planet and who governs the colony, science is telling us something that could make the entire colonization enterprise morally catastrophic. Something may already be living there, and we are about to step on it before we even know what it is. Chapter 9. If something is already alive, there. We talked about the Chayava Falls rock at the beginning of this documentary, but that was the headline. Now we need the full story, because the full story is what turns Mars colonization from an engineering challenge into a moral crisis. In July of 2024, NASA's Perseverance rover was driving through Neretva Vallis, an ancient river valley on the western edge of Jezero crater. Jezero was chosen as the landing site for Perseverance specifically because orbital images revealed a river delta, clear evidence that a large lake once filled the crater billions of years ago. Lakes are potentially habitable environments. River deltas are excellent preservers of ancient life. If Mars ever hosted microbes, Jezero was one of the best places on the planet to look for their remains. The rover entered a region called the Bright Angel Formation, a set of rocky outcrops along the edges of the ancient river valley, and there it encountered a rock, arrowhead-shaped, roughly 1 meter by 0.6 meters. Unremarkable to look at first glance. The science team nicknamed it Chayava Falls after one of the waterfalls in the Grand Canyon. Perseverance's instruments went to work. The Pixel instrument, which uses X-ray lithochemistry to map the elemental composition of rocks at the sub-millimeter scale, revealed something extraordinary. The rock was made of clay and silt, fine-grained sediment deposited by water, and within that sediment, arranged in patterns unlike anything the instrument had seen on Mars before, were concentrations of iron, phosphorus, and sulfur. Small dark spots, which the team called poppy seeds, dotted the surface. Larger formations, lighter in the center with dark rims, earned the name leopard spots. And the Sherlock instrument, designed specifically to detect organic compounds, confirmed the presence of organic carbon within the rock. On Earth, this combination of features tells a specific story. It tells the story of microbes, organisms that lived in mud, consumed organic matter, and in the process reduced iron and sulfur compounds, leaving behind distinctive chemical fingerprints in the minerals around them. The leopard spot pattern, in particular, is well known to geologists who study ancient microbial life on Earth. It forms when microorganisms create localized zones of chemical reduction in otherwise oxidized sediment. The reduced zones appear as lighter spots surrounded by darker, iron-rich rims. The peer-reviewed paper, published in Nature in September of 2025 with Joel Hurowitz of Stony Brook University as lead author, examined every plausible non-biological explanation for the patterns observed in Chayava Falls. Could high-temperature processes have created them? The rock shows no evidence of having experienced the temperatures required. Could purely chemical reactions without biology have produced the mineral associations? The known abiotic mechanisms do not match the specific arrangement of iron phosphate and iron sulfide minerals found in the rock. The paper did not claim to have found life on Mars. Science does not work that way. What it said was that the textures, chemical characteristics, and organic signatures observed in the Bright Angel Formation warrant consideration as potential biosignatures. And the acting NASA administrator, at the press conference announcing the findings, said something more direct. He said that after a year of review, the scientists could not find another explanation, that this very well could be the clearest sign of life that we have ever found on Mars. Warrant consideration. Clearest sign. These are the careful phrases that scientists use when they are standing at the edge of something enormous and do not want to fall in prematurely. But make no mistake about what they mean. They mean that we may be looking at the fossil record of organisms that lived in a Martian lake more than 3 billion years ago. They mean that life on Earth may not be unique, that the chemistry of living things may have ignited independently on 2 separate worlds in the same solar system. That would be the most significant scientific discovery in human history, more significant than the structure of DNA, more significant than the theory of relativity, more significant than the discovery of fire, because it would answer the question that has haunted our species since we first looked up at the stars and wondered, are we alone? And then came the second study. In July of 2025, a team led by Dimitra Atri at New York University, Abu Dhabi, published research in the International Journal of Astrobiology that introduced the concept of the radiolytic habitable zone. The key finding was this: galactic cosmic rays, the same radiation that threatens the health of astronauts, can penetrate the Martian surface and split apart water molecules in underground ice. When those molecules break apart, they release electrons and hydrogen. And on Earth, in the deep gold mines of South Africa, there is a bacterium called Disulfurudis or Daxviator that survives by harvesting exactly this kind of radiation-driven chemistry. This organism lives kilometers below the surface, in total darkness, completely cut off from the sun and from photosynthesis. It gets its energy from the chemical products of radiolysis. And the researchers showed through detailed simulations that Mars, with its thin atmosphere and subsurface ice, has environments where the same process could occur, not billions of years ago, right now. The energy available from cosmic ray-driven radiolysis in the upper few meters of the Martian subsurface is sufficient, according to the study, to sustain basic microbial metabolisms. The peak energy deposition occurs roughly 0.6 meters below the surface, close enough that human surface operations could easily disturb it, close enough that a bulldozer preparing a habitat foundation or a drill extracting water ice could punch directly into the zone where life, if it exists, would be most concentrated. And this is where the two stories collide. On one hand, we have a potential biosignature in a Martian rock suggesting that life may have existed on Mars in the ancient past. On the other hand, we have a theoretical framework backed by simulations and by the existence of analogous organisms on Earth, suggesting that life may still exist on Mars today, hidden just below the surface. And in between these two discoveries, there is a plan to land human beings on Mars and build a permanent colony. Human beings are biological disasters from the perspective of planetary protection. We are walking ecosystems. The average human body contains roughly 38 trillion human cells, and roughly the same number of bacterial cells. We shed skin cells constantly. We exhale bacteria with every breath. Our gut microbiomes contain thousands of species of organisms, many of which are extraordinarily resilient. Some of these organisms can survive exposure to vacuum, extreme cold, radiation, and desiccation. They are, in many cases, harder to kill than we are. The planetary protection protocols maintained by COSPAR, the Committee on Space Research, set strict standards for how much biological contamination a spacecraft can carry to Mars. Robotic missions are sterilized. Components are baked. Clean rooms are maintained. And even with these precautions, perfect sterility is never achieved. There are always surviving organisms, tucked into crevices, embedded in adhesives, dormant in the most inaccessible parts of the spacecraft. For robotic missions, this residual contamination is a manageable risk. The chances that a few dormant bacteria on a rover will establish themselves in the Martian environment are considered small, though not zero. But human missions are a different category entirely. You cannot sterilize a human being. You cannot bake an astronaut in an oven to kill the organisms living on and inside them. The moment a human being sets foot on Mars, Earth life arrives in force. And once it arrives, it cannot be recalled. Every time an airlock opens, every time a suit is depressurized and brought inside, every time a colonist handles soil samples or drills into regolith, or walks through an area where ice exists near the surface, there is a transfer of Earth organisms into the Martian environment. Over months and years, the contamination zone around a human settlement would expand. Earth bacteria would be introduced to Martian soil, Martian water ice, and Martian subsurface environments. If Martian life exists in the subsurface, and it is biochemically different from Earth life, we might be able to distinguish the two even after contamination. But if Martian life is similar to Earth life, if it uses the same basic chemistry, the same genetic molecules, the same metabolic pathways, then contamination could make it impossible to determine what was Martian and what was terrestrial. We would have destroyed the evidence before we knew what it said. And if Martian life is fragile, if it exists in small populations sustained by the thin energy budget of radiolysis, then the introduction of Earth organisms could overwhelm it. Earth bacteria are resilient, competitive, and adaptable. They have been shaped by billions of years of evolution in environments far more demanding than a Martian subsurface ice pocket. They could outcompete native organisms for the limited resources available. They could destroy a second genesis of life, proof that biology is not unique to our world, and we would never know what we had lost. Robert Zubrin, one of the most prominent advocates for Mars colonization, has argued that even if Martian microbes exist, the moral imperative to preserve human civilization outweighs any obligation to preserve alien bacteria. He frames the question as a utilitarian calculation. Billions of human lives against an alien microbe. The math, he says, is obvious. Others disagree profoundly. They argue that the discovery of a second, independent origin of life would be the most important scientific finding in the history of our species, that it would tell us something fundamental about the probability of life in the universe, that it would reshape our understanding of biology, of chemistry, of our own origins, and that destroying it through carelessness or haste, before we have even confirmed its existence, would be an act of irreversible destruction that no moral calculus can justify. The ethics of this question are not abstract, they are operational. The Perseverance rover is on Mars right now, with 30 samples collected and waiting for a return mission that has not yet been funded or fully designed. Those samples could contain the answer, but the samples sit on Mars, in sealed tubes, while the mission to bring them home remains in the concept phase, tangled in budget disputes and political indifference. We may be about to make an irreversible decision about another living world, and most of the people alive today have never been asked their opinion. The window to answer the question of whether Mars harbors life may close the moment a human settlement begins operation, and once that window closes, it does not reopen. Contamination is permanent. The question, unanswered, remains unanswered forever. That is the weight that the first boot print on Mars will carry, not just the weight of a human being, the weight of a question that the entire species should have answered first. And yet, despite all of this, despite the radiation, the distance, the legal vacuum, the possible destruction of alien life, there are people who want to go, who have always wanted to go, who raised their hands when asked and said, "Yes, send me." Understanding who they are and why is essential to understanding what Mars colonization really means, not as an engineering project, but as a human one. Chapter 10: The Volunteers Who Said Yes. In 2013, a small Dutch non-profit called Mars One announced an open call for volunteers willing to make a one-way trip to Mars. The plan was straightforward in its audacity: select a crew, train them, launch them, land them, and leave them there, permanently. There was no return mission built into the architecture, no plan to bring anyone home. The entire concept was designed around the premise that the volunteers understood and accepted that they would live the rest of their lives on Mars and die there. 200,000 people applied, from every continent, every age group, every walk of life: teachers, engineers, doctors, artists, students, retirees, people with families and careers and houses full of things they would never see again. Not 200, not 2,000. 200,000 human beings looked at the prospect of permanent exile on a hostile world and said yes. Mars One ultimately failed. The organization went bankrupt in 2019 without ever launching anything more than a feasibility study. The technology was never developed. The funding never materialized. The project was widely criticized as unrealistic, poorly planned, and in some assessments, exploitative of the volunteers' willingness. But the volunteers were real. Their desire was real, and the sheer number of them demands an explanation that goes beyond dismissing them as dreamers or fools. Psychological studies of the most serious Mars One candidates revealed a consistent profile: high openness to experience, the personality trait associated with intellectual curiosity, creativity, and willingness to engage with the unfamiliar; high tolerance for ambiguity, the ability to function without clear answers or guaranteed outcomes; and elevated self-transcendence, the tendency to find meaning in purposes that extend beyond individual self-interest. To see oneself as part of something larger. To feel that contributing to a cause that outlives you is worth the cost of the contribution. These are not abnormal traits. They are not signs of pathology or recklessness. They are, in many ways, the traits that have driven every expansion in human history. The Polynesian navigators, who crossed the Pacific in open canoes, were open to experience. The first humans to migrate out of Africa were tolerant of ambiguity. The pilgrims who boarded leaking ships bound for a continent they had never seen were self-transcendent. The Mars One volunteers were not broken people seeking escape. Many of them had fulfilling lives, close relationships, professional accomplishments. They were not running from something. They were running toward something. Something they could articulate, in interview after interview, with remarkable consistency. The chance to be part of the greatest adventure in human history. The chance to extend the reach of the species, the chance to stand on soil that no human being had ever touched and know that they were the beginning of something that might last forever. And yet, here is the hardest question this chapter has to ask. There is a difference between what the volunteers understood intellectually and what they could not have understood experientially. Humans routinely make commitments whose consequences they cannot fully anticipate. Marriage, parenthood, immigration, career, changes. In all of these cases, the person making the decision has some abstract knowledge of what lies ahead, but cannot truly know what it will feel like to live inside that choice until they are already committed. The gap between knowledge and experience is always present. But for Mars colonization, that gap may be the largest in any decision a human being could make. The volunteer who applied at 29 imagined standing on red soil at dawn, the sun rising over the rim of a crater, the thin Martian sky shifting from black to deep blue to the salmon pink that Martian sunsets are famous for. They imagined exploration, discovery, purpose. They imagined the pride of being the first. They did not imagine, because they could not imagine, what it feels like to sit alone in a sealed habitat 5 years later, watching a recorded video of their mother's funeral, knowing that the message they dread has been sitting in their inbox for 3 days because they were afraid to open it. They did not imagine the particular quality of silence in a room where the only sounds are the hum of the air recycler and the distant whir of a pump. They did not imagine what it means to look out a window and see nothing but dust and rock stretching to a horizon that never changes, knowing that this is the only view they will ever have for the rest of their life. Informed consent, in medical and research ethics, requires that a person understand not just the facts of a decision but its material consequences. A surgeon must explain not just what will be removed, but what life will be like afterward. A researcher must describe not just the procedure, but the risks and the alternatives. Can informed consent be given for a life on Mars? The risks are quantifiable. Radiation doses can be calculated. Communication delays can be timed. Physical deterioration can be modeled. But the experience of living those risks, day after day, year after year, with no possibility of reversal, is something that cannot be modeled. It can only be lived. And by the time it is lived, the consent that was given has already been irrevocably exercised. The volunteers of Mars 1 accepted a one-way trip. The current generation of volunteers, those who orbit the SpaceX community, and who would board a Starship tomorrow if offered the chance, believe they are signing up for a round trip. SpaceX promises a return journey. The marketing materials depict starships lifting off from Mars and returning to Earth. But as we established in Chapter 7, that return depends on technology that does not yet fully exist. The ISRU plant has not been built. The cryogenic storage problem has not been solved. The reliability chain has not been tested. The volunteers of today may be signing up for something labeled round trip that functions, in practice, as one way. What obligations do mission architects have to make that distinction clear? At what point does optimistic framing become misrepresentation? If a volunteer consents to a Mars mission believing they have a 90% chance of returning, and the actual probability, accounting for untested systems and unsolved engineering challenges, is closer to 50%, has informed consent been obtained, is less than #0, 5# is greater than. These are not hypothetical legal questions. They are questions that will be asked in courtrooms or in congressional hearings if something goes wrong. If a crew arrives on Mars and discovers that the return is not possible, the consent forms they signed before departure will be examined under a legal microscope, and the question will be whether they were told the truth about what they were agreeing to. But beyond the legal questions, the existence of these volunteers tells us something about the human species that deserves to be taken seriously. Something in us responds to the call of the beyond. Something in us has always been willing to accept terrible risk in exchange for the chance to see what lies on the other side of the horizon. This impulse is not rational. It cannot be reduced to a cost-benefit analysis. It is deeper than reason. It is the thing that sent the first fishing boats out of sight of land, the thing that built the first ships capable of crossing oceans, the thing that put Neil Armstrong on the moon. The volunteers are not anomalies. They are what we are. The question is not whether the impulse is real. The question is whether it should always be indulged. whether the willingness to go is sufficient justification for being sent, whether the dream of Mars, beautiful and compelling and ancient as it is, should override the obligation to ensure that the dreamers understand what they are giving up. Because the price of going to Mars is not paid in money, it is paid in years, in relationships, in health, in the slow accumulation of losses that compound across a lifetime spent on a world that was not designed for human bodies or human minds. And the highest price may not be paid by the volunteers at all. It may be paid by people who never volunteered for anything. The children, the first human beings born on Mars, who had no say in the matter and no option to leave. But before we reach the children, we need to talk about the technology itself, not the dream of it, not the animations and the promotional videos and the artist renderings of gleaming habitats on russet plains. The actual, present-day, tested and untested technology that stands between the human species and a Mars colony. Because the gap between what has been demonstrated and what is required is not a gap that confidence alone can close. Chapter 11. The technology we are betting our lives on. The largest object ever successfully landed on the surface of Mars is the Perseverance rover. It weighs approximately 1 metric ton, 1,000 kilograms, about the weight of a small car. Landing it required one of the most complex engineering sequences ever attempted. A heat shield absorbing the brutal deceleration of atmospheric entry, a supersonic parachute deploying at precisely the right altitude, a powered descent stage firing rockets to slow the vehicle further, and finally, the sky crane, a hovering platform that lowered the rover on cables to the surface while the platform itself flew away and crashed at a safe distance. The entire sequence lasted 7 minutes. Engineers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory called those 7 minutes the 7 minutes of terror because there was nothing they could do but watch. The light speed delay meant the rover had already landed or already crashed by the time its signals reached Earth. A human Mars mission requires landing not 1 ton but 50 to 100 tons, 50 to 100 times the mass of Perseverance. Habitats, life support systems, power generators, ISRO equipment, food, water, medical supplies, tools, and human beings who, unlike rovers, cannot survive a hard landing or be rebooted if something goes wrong. The physics of landing heavy payloads on Mars is fundamentally different from landing light ones, and the difference is not a matter of scaling up existing technology. It is a matter of inventing new technology that has never been demonstrated. The problem is the atmosphere. Mars has one, barely, and it creates a paradox for mission designers. It is thick enough to generate significant aerodynamic heating during entry, requiring a heat shield, but it is too thin to provide meaningful deceleration for heavy objects. A parachute that works beautifully for a 1-ton rover generates nowhere near enough drag to slow a 100-ton payload. The physics does not scale linearly. A parachute large enough to decelerate a Starship-class vehicle in the Martian atmosphere would be so enormous that the engineering challenges of deploying it become as difficult as the landing itself. SpaceX's proposed solution is supersonic retropropulsion, firing the vehicle's engines backward while the vehicle is still moving faster than the speed of sound through the Martian atmosphere. The engines push against the oncoming air, creating a complex interaction between the exhaust plume and the supersonic airflow that generates shock waves capable of destabilizing the vehicle. The company has demonstrated supersonic retropropulsion on Earth during Falcon 9 booster landings, but Earth's atmosphere is roughly 100 times denser than Mars's. The aerodynamic conditions are completely different. The shock interactions that occur when engines fire into a thin supersonic airstream on Mars have been described by engineers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory as one of the hardest problems to model accurately. The shock fronts created by the engines interacting with the oncoming flow could potentially destabilize the vehicle during the most critical phase of landing. And there is no abort option. The vehicle either lands successfully or it does not. There is no going around for a second attempt. There is no runway to divert to. There is no ejection seat. The crew is inside a vehicle that is either performing a maneuver never before attempted at this scale on Mars, or they are inside a vehicle that is about to hit the Martian surface at a speed that turns everything inside it into debris. The engines themselves present their own challenge. A Starship arriving at Mars has been in space for 6 to 9 months. Its engines have been dormant for the entire transit, exposed to the radiation and temperature extremes of interplanetary space, subjected to the micrometeorite environment, and sitting idle with no possibility of maintenance or inspection. When the vehicle reaches Mars and begins its entry and landing sequence, those engines must ignite on command. First try. No test firing. No warm-up. The first time they light is the time they must work perfectly. If they do not ignite, the vehicle crashes. If they ignite but produce uneven thrust, the vehicle tumbles. If they ignite but cannot be throttled precisely enough to achieve a controlled landing, the vehicle impacts at a speed that no occupant survives. Every scenario except perfect execution ends in catastrophe. On the ground, assuming the landing succeeds, the technology must sustain human life indefinitely, and this is where the gap between what exists and what is required becomes most stark. The International Space Station uses what engineers call an open-loop life support architecture. Fresh supplies arrive regularly from Earth. Water, oxygen, food, and spare parts are delivered on resupply missions that dock every few months. The station does recycle some water and generate some oxygen from carbon dioxide, but these systems are supplemental. They reduce the amount of material that must be shipped from Earth, but they do not eliminate the need for resupply. If the supply ships stopped coming, the station would become uninhabitable within months. Mars colonies need closed-loop life support, systems that recycle water completely, that regenerate oxygen from carbon dioxide indefinitely, that process human waste into usable resources, that grow food using nothing but Martian soil, artificial light, and recycled nutrients. Systems that do all of this simultaneously, without failure, for years, with no external resupply. No such system has ever supported humans for the multi-year durations Mars requires. The most ambitious attempt was Biosphere 2, a 3-acre enclosed ecosystem built in the Arizona desert in the early 1990s. 8 people entered the sealed facility with the goal of sustaining themselves for 2 years, using only the resources inside. It did not go well. Within months, oxygen levels began to drop. The concrete of the structure was absorbing carbon dioxide and reacting with it, removing oxygen from the atmosphere faster than the plants could replace it. The crew experienced caloric restriction as food production fell short of projections. Interpersonal conflict escalated. Respiratory distress set in as the atmosphere degraded. Twice, additional oxygen had to be pumped in from outside, a correction that would have been impossible on Mars. Biosphere 2 operated on Earth, in full gravity, with ambient temperatures that did not require heating, with abundant sunlight, with a team of engineers and scientists standing just outside the sealed doors, ready to intervene if something went genuinely wrong. And it still failed to maintain stable life support for 2 years. Mars life support must outperform Biosphere 2 in every dimension. It must function in reduced gravity, which affects fluid dynamics and plant growth in ways that are not fully understood. It must operate without external support. It must handle the perchlorate contaminated Martian dust that will inevitably enter the habitat. It must be repairable using only the tools and spare parts available on Mars. And it must do all of this without the option of opening the door, because outside the door is death. And then there is medicine. On Earth, if you develop appendicitis, you go to a hospital. A surgeon who trained for years performs a procedure they have done hundreds of times in an operating room designed for the purpose, with anesthesiologists and nurses and sterile instruments and blood products and recovery wards. The surgery has a complication rate of less than 2%. It is routine. On Mars, appendicitis is a crisis. The surgeon may be a geologist who completed a 6-week emergency medical training module before departure. The operating room may be a table in the common area, cleared of dinner trays. The instruments may be repurposed tools. The anesthesia may be managed by another non-specialist reading from a digital manual on a 20-minute delay from a consulting physician on Earth, whose advice arrives after the critical decision has already been made. And appendicitis is a relatively simple condition. What about a stroke, a heart attack, cancer? Which radiation exposure makes significantly more likely? A complex fracture requiring surgical stabilization, a dental abscess that progresses to a systemic infection. Each of these conditions requires specialized knowledge, specialized equipment, and on Earth, a specialist who devoted their career to treating it. A Mars crew cannot include a specialist for every possible condition. The crew is small. Every member has multiple roles. The person performing emergency surgery may be the same person who was fixing the water recycler that morning. Even dental care, something we take for granted as a minor medical concern, becomes a potential life-threatening emergency on Mars. An untreated tooth abscess can progress to a systemic infection within days. The antibiotics to treat it must have been anticipated, packed, transported across 225 million kilometers, and stored without degradation. If the right antibiotic is not available, if the abscess does not respond to treatment, the infection can spread to the bloodstream. On Earth, you go to the emergency room. On Mars, you manage with what you have or you die. The gap between what medicine can do on Earth and what it can do on Mars is the distance between life and death, measured in the weight of a dental kit that someone had to decide, years before launch, whether to include. The technology to go to Mars exists, or nearly does. The technology to land on Mars, to sustain life there, to return from there, to practice medicine there, to grow food there, to survive there for years or decades, does not exist in the form that would be required. Pieces of it have been demonstrated. Proofs of concept have been achieved. But the integrated system, the complete end-to-end chain of technologies that must all work simultaneously for a human colony to survive, has never been built, never been tested, and never been operated at the scale and duration that Mars demands. We are not going to Mars with proven technology. We are going to Mars with a plan to develop the technology along the way. And the people inside that plan, the human beings whose lives depend on every link in the chain, deserve to know the difference. And they deserve to know something else too, something that no amount of engineering can prevent. People will die on Mars, not as a possibility, as a certainty. The only question is when, and how, and whether we are honest enough to say so before we send them. Chapter 12. The First Martian Graves. This chapter is quiet. It has to be. Because what we are discussing now is not engineering or politics or orbital mechanics. It is the certainty that human beings will die on Mars, not as a risk to be calculated, not as a probability to be managed, as an inevitability to be faced. Every Mars mission architecture, every plan ever drafted by NASA or SpaceX or the European Space Agency or any private organization that has seriously examined the problem, includes a fatality probability that would be considered unacceptable in any other context on Earth. NASA's own radiation studies estimate that the excess cancer mortality risk for a Mars round-trip crew could exceed 5% at the central estimate. The upper bound approaches 10%. That means 1 in 10 crew members may die of radiation-induced cancer as a direct result of the mission. 10%. A commercial airline with a 10% fatality rate would be grounded permanently. A hospital with a 10% surgical mortality rate would be shut down and investigated. An industrial operation with a 10% worker fatality rate would be closed by regulators and its operators prosecuted. And that is radiation alone. It does not include the probability of landing failure, of life support malfunction, of habitat breach, of medical emergency, of the 100 other ways that Mars can kill the people who attempt to live there. Each risk adds to the cumulative probability. And when you compound those probabilities across a multi-year mission involving a small crew with no possibility of rescue, the likelihood that the first crewed Mars mission produces at least one death is not small. Mission planners know this. Engineers know this. The people who design these missions have calculated the probabilities and incorporated them into their planning. They call it acceptable risk. They define thresholds, they draw lines on graphs, and assign numbers to outcomes. And in the quiet mathematics of risk assessment, a 5 or 10% chance of losing a crew member is considered tolerable because the alternative, never going at all, is considered worse. But someone should say it plainly, because the people who will board those spacecraft deserve plain language, not probability distributions. People will die on Mars, specific people, with names and faces and families who will miss them. And the deaths will not be heroic abstractions. They will be concrete events involving fear and pain and the particular aloneness of dying on a world where help cannot arrive. Think about what it would actually mean. A crew member dies on Mars. Perhaps a suit breach during a surface excursion. The depressurization is rapid. The cold hits first, then the vacuum. The other crew members watch it happen from 10 meters away, unable to reach their colleague before the atmosphere inside the suit is gone. They recover the body. They carry it inside. And then they are standing in a habitat that was designed for 6 people but now holds 5. Looking at someone they lived with for over a year, someone they ate meals with and ran diagnostics with and argued with about nothing, and that person is dead. There is no hospital to take the body to. There is no mortician. There is no funeral home. There is no protocol. Yet, for what you do with a human body on the surface of Mars, do you bury it? The Martian regolith is cold and dry and laden with perchlorates. Do you preserve it, in the hope that a future return mission might bring it home? That requires resources, refrigeration, space in a habitat that cannot afford to waste any. Do you cremate it? That requires energy that the colony may not be able to spare. The surviving crew notifies Earth. They record a message. They describe what happened. The message travels at the speed of light and arrives on Earth between 4 and 24 minutes later. The family learns that their loved one is dead. They learn this fact from a recording, not from a person. They cannot ask questions. They cannot say goodbye. They cannot hold anyone who was there when it happened. And the surviving crew must continue working. The mission does not stop because someone died. The life support still needs maintenance. The ISRU plant still needs monitoring. The habitat still needs to function. The crew, now smaller, now traumatized, now carrying a grief that has no outlet and no ritual to contain it, must perform the same tasks with fewer people, each of them knowing, in a way that they could not have fully known before, that the same thing could happen to them tomorrow. The death of the first human being on Mars will be the most watched death in human history, not in real time, because the light speed delay prevents that. But in the hours and days that follow, when the recordings and the reports reach Earth, the entire world will witness what happened. And the death will have occurred, from Earth's perspective, many minutes before anyone on Earth knew it was happening. There is something particularly cruel about that delay. The moment of death exists in a kind of temporal solitude. It happens on Mars, observed only by those present, and does not become real to the rest of humanity until the light carrying the news finishes its long journey through the void. But the first death on Mars, as devastating as it would be, is not the heaviest thing this chapter has to carry. The heaviest thing is the children. We talked about them in Chapter 3. The biology, the bones that form in reduced gravity, the bodies calibrated for a world that is not Earth. We talked about them in Chapter 4. The radiation, the developing cells, the risks that no one has quantified because no one has been willing to run the experiment. But we have not talked about what it means, emotionally, for a child to be born on Mars. A child born on Mars did not choose to be there. That sentence is worth sitting with. Every ethical framework we have for discussing risk and consent begins with the premise that the person exposed to the risk had the opportunity to agree or refuse. Adults who volunteer for Mars can give informed consent, however imperfect. Children born on Mars cannot give consent at all. Their existence on that world is a consequence of their parents' decision, a decision made for them, without them, before they existed. That child will grow up in a sealed habitat. The largest room they will ever know will be measured in meters, not kilometers. They will not walk through a forest. They will not feel rain on their skin. They will not wade into an ocean or climb a mountain or sit in a field of grass under an open sky. Everything they know about Earth, about the world their species evolved on over millions of years, will come from screens and stories and the fading memories of adults who once lived there. They will know they are human, but they will experience almost nothing of what humanity, as a civilization, has accumulated over thousands of years. No concerts, no crowds, no cities, no neighborhoods where you can walk to a friend's house, no natural landscape that does not require a pressure suit to visit. Their world will be small and engineered and utterly dependent on technology for every breath. And if the biology we discussed in Chapter 3 is correct, if their bodies calibrate to Martian gravity during development, they may never be able to visit Earth. The world their parents left, the world that every story and every lesson and every recorded message from across the void tells them is home, will be a place they can see but never touch. A dot of light in the Martian sky, impossibly far away, containing everything their species has ever built, and inaccessible to them as if it were in another galaxy. The first child born on Mars will be the loneliest human being in history, and they will have no idea why. Because loneliness, for them, will not be a condition, it will be the world. It will be all they have ever known. They will not miss Earth because they have never been there. They will not grieve for what they lost because they never had it. They will simply live in a small habitat on a cold world, under a sky that does not protect them, surrounded by adults who remember something better and cannot explain, not really, what it felt like. The parents chose Mars. The children inherited it. And the gap between choosing a world and being born into it is a gap that no amount of engineering or enthusiasm can close. When we talk about Mars colonization, we talk about rockets and habitats and fuel and technology. We talk about it as an engineering problem with engineering solutions. But the first Martian graves will not be an engineering problem. They will be a human one. Bodies that failed, minds that broke, lives that ended far from everything that once gave them meaning. And somewhere in that colony, a child looking at a pale blue dot in the sky, not knowing what it means, not feeling the loss, because they never had the thing that was lost. That is the true price of going to Mars. Not the money, not the fuel, not the technology. The price is measured in human lives that will be shorter, harder, more isolated, and more constrained than any lives humans have lived since we first walked out of Africa and spread across a planet that, for all its dangers, at least had air we could breathe and water we could drink and a sky that did not want to kill us. And the question that hangs over all of it, the question that this entire documentary has been building toward, is whether the price is worth paying. Chapter 13: The Price of Becoming Martian. Let us be honest about what is lost, not abstractly, specifically, because the losses of Mars colonization are not theoretical. They are concrete, and they accumulate across a lifetime. A parent watches their child's first steps in a recorded video that arrives 3 weeks after the steps were taken. By the time they see it, their child is already running. The moment is already gone. They record a message of joy and send it back, and it arrives on Earth 3 weeks later, when the child has moved on to something else entirely. The parent and the child exist in the same universe, but not in the same time. A spouse grows old on a different planet. The messages continue for years. They share news. They describe their days. They say "I love you" into a camera and send it into the void. But the spontaneity that makes love feel alive, the unexpected touch, the shared silence in the same room, the ability to turn to someone in the middle of the night and know they are there, all of that is gone. What remains is correspondence. Beautiful, perhaps. Devoted, perhaps. But not presence. Never presence again. A friendship sustained for years through asynchronous messages eventually goes quiet, not because anyone stopped caring, because correspondence is not the same as companionship, because the effort of maintaining a connection across a 20-minute time delay and a widening experiential gap becomes heavier with each passing year, and eventually, silence is easier. Not better. Easier. Cultural belonging disappears. The colonist receives news of political events in countries they no longer inhabit, cultural movements that evolved without them, music they have never heard performed live, jokes whose references they no longer share. The language itself may drift. Slang changes. New words enter common usage. The colonist speaks a version of their native language that is gradually becoming archaic, while the living language on Earth moves on without them. The Earth the colonist left behind becomes, over years, a foreign country, a place they remember but no longer recognize, a place where they would be a stranger if they could somehow return. And they know this. They watch it happen in the messages and news broadcasts and cultural artifacts that arrive from a world moving forward without them. They become a historical figure while they are still alive, occasionally remembered, rarely considered, the subject of a documentary watched by people who will never meet them, and their body, bone by bone and cell by cell, it is becoming something that cannot go back, the skeleton thinning, the heart remodeling, the radiation accumulating in every tissue, the eyes changing, the lifespan shortening. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, measurably, irreversibly. The colonist is becoming Martian in the most literal sense. Their biology is being shaped by a world that is not the world their genes were written for. This is what is given up, not in a moment of dramatic sacrifice, in a slow accretion of small losses that compound across years until the person who left Earth is no longer, in any biological or cultural or experiential sense, the same person who arrived on Mars. Now let us be equally honest about what might be gained, because dismissing the case for Mars colonization is not honest either, and the people who want to go deserve to have their reasons taken seriously. The insurance argument is the strongest and the simplest. The human species currently exists on one planet. Every person, every culture, every book, every piece of music, every memory, every achievement in the entire history of human civilization exists on a single rock, orbiting a single star. If something happens to that rock, if an asteroid strikes, if a pandemic escapes containment, if nuclear war destroys the infrastructure that keeps 8 billion people alive, then everything is lost. Not just us, everything we have ever made, or thought, or loved, or wondered about, gone. A self-sustaining colony on Mars would be an insurance policy against that extinction. Not a comfortable one, not a luxurious backup, but a continuation. A remnant of the species that would carry forward the accumulated knowledge and culture of a civilization, however imperfectly, into a future that Earth's destruction would otherwise have erased. Is that worth the cost? The cost we have spent 12 chapters documenting. The broken bones and damaged brains and stranded families and lonely children. If the alternative is the total extinction of everything human, then maybe the suffering of thousands is justified by the survival of the species. Maybe the children born on Mars, who will never see Earth, are a price that the 8 billion people on Earth are willing to pay on their behalf. The meaning argument is harder to quantify but equally real. Some lives can only be fulfilled through extraordinary challenge. The Mars One volunteers were not deluded. Many of them understood the risks with remarkable clarity and chose to go anyway. They found meaning in the purpose itself, in being the first, in contributing to something that would outlast their individual lives. This is not pathology. This is a deeply human response to the fundamental problem of mortality. We all die. The question is whether what we did before dying mattered. For some people, the only satisfactory answer to that question involves reaching for something that most people would consider impossible. The expansion argument draws on the full sweep of human history. Every frontier has required people willing to pay prices that their stay-at-home contemporaries considered absurd. The first Polynesians to navigate to Hawaii left behind everything they knew and set out across open ocean in canoes, with no guarantee of finding land. Thousands of them died. The ones who survived established one of the most remarkable cultures in human history. The first European colonists to cross the Atlantic endured mortality rates that would horrify a modern ethicist. Half the Mayflower passengers died in the first winter, and yet, 3 centuries later, the civilization that grew from those desperate, suffering colonies had become the most powerful on Earth. Were those deaths justified? That question cannot be answered without imposing one moral framework over another. The dead cannot weigh in. The descendants who benefited from the sacrifice have an obvious bias. The contemporaries who stayed behind were proven wrong in their pessimism, but they were not irrational at the time. Mars colonization fits this pattern. The people who go will suffer. Some of them will die. The civilization they build, if they build one, will take centuries to develop. And the people alive today who are making the decision to go or not to go are doing so with radically incomplete information about what the future holds. Perhaps the volunteers for Mars are right about something we cannot yet see. Perhaps the act of reaching for another world, despite the cost, despite the suffering, despite the uncertainty, will prove to be the most important thing our species ever did. Or perhaps it will prove to be a tragic miscalculation, a project born of hubris that consumed lives and resources that could have been better spent solving the problems of the world we already have. We do not know, we cannot know, and the honesty of admitting that is more valuable than any confident prediction in either direction. But there is one more dimension to this question. one that lifts it out of the domain of individual choice and into the domain of collective decision. Mars colonization is not just a decision individual volunteers make. It is a decision the human species is making about what kind of thing it wants to be. A species that stays home, that tends its garden, that solves its existing problems before reaching for new ones. Or a species that expands, that accepts tremendous individual sacrifice in exchange for the possibility of long-term survival and growth, that is willing to let some of its members become permanently other in order to ensure that the whole does not perish on a single world. This is a political and philosophical question dressed in engineering language, and the public has never been asked to vote on it. The decision is being made by companies and space agencies, by engineers and executives, by people who will not personally bear the costs of the decision they are making. The volunteers who raise their hands will pay the price. The children who are born on Mars will inherit the price. But the decision itself, the decision to commit the first Martians to permanent exile on behalf of all the rest of us who get to stay, that decision is being made without the consent of most of the people it affects. Who decides? That is the question this documentary has been circling since the first chapter. Who was elected? Who was authorized? Who looked at all the evidence, all the risks, all the costs, and said, yes, this is worth it? Because if we are going to send human beings to die on another world, if we are going to create a new branch of the human species that can never come home, if we are going to risk contaminating an alien biosphere before we know what lives there, then the decision should be made in the open, by everyone, not in a boardroom, not in a terms of service agreement, not in an animation rendered by a marketing department. In the open, where the costs are named, where the losses are counted, where the price is visible. And that brings us, finally, to the end, to the pale blue dot, to the moment that everything we have discussed becomes real. Chapter 14. The pale blue dot looking back. Picture the moment. A human being stands on the surface of Mars. They are suited, helmeted, breathing recycled air that tastes faintly of the filters that cleaned it. Their boots press into regolith that no human foot has ever touched before. The ground beneath them is iron oxide, rust, the color of old blood, stretching in every direction to a horizon that is slightly closer than Earth's because Mars is a smaller world. It is early morning. The sun is rising, smaller than it appears from Earth, casting a light that is noticeably dimmer, noticeably colder, noticeably less like home. The sky is not blue. It is a pale butterscotch, thinning to something like lavender near the horizon, where the fine dust particles in the atmosphere scatter what little light they can catch. The astronaut looks up, past the sun, past the thin sky, into the darkness above, where stars are visible even during the Martian day because the atmosphere is too thin to wash them out. And somewhere in that darkness, low on the horizon, barely distinguishable from the surrounding points of light, there is a faint blue dot. Earth. That dot contains 8 billion people, every book ever written, every piece of music ever composed, every act of love or cruelty or genius or ordinary kindness in the history of human civilization, every person the astronaut has ever known, every street they have ever walked, every room they have ever slept in, every conversation they have ever had that lasted past midnight because neither person wanted it to end, all of it, compressed into a point of light. They will never get closer to it. That fact settles into the astronaut like a physical weight. They have known it intellectually since before they launched. They signed papers acknowledging it. They discussed it with psychologists. They told their families. But knowing it and feeling it are different things. And right now, standing on the surface of a world that is trying to kill them in every way a world can try, looking at the pale blue dot that contains everything they have ever loved, they feel it. In 1990, the Voyager 1 spacecraft, at the urging of astronomer Carl Sagan, turned its camera back toward the inner solar system from a distance of 6 billion kilometers. The photograph it captured showed Earth as a speck of light, a fraction of a pixel, suspended in a scattered beam of sunlight. Sagan called it the pale blue dot, and his words about that image have become some of the most quoted in the history of science. He spoke about the smallness of Earth, about the folly of human pretensions, about the responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve the only home we have ever known. The astronaut on Mars is seeing something Sagan never saw, not a photograph, the real thing. From a distance of 55 million kilometers, on a good day, 200 million on a typical day, the Earth is not a world. It is a point of light. And everything the astronaut has given up, everything they will never experience again, is contained in that point. This documentary does not take a position on whether Mars colonization should happen. That is not its place. The question is too large, too consequential, and too personal for any single film to answer. What it can do, what it has tried to do, is lay out the costs as plainly as possible, so that the decision, when it is made with open eyes. But this documentary does take a very clear position on one thing: what those who stay behind owe those who go. They are owed the truth, not marketing, not inspiration dressed as information, not animated videos showing gleaming rockets and clean habitats and confident timelines. The truth. The full, unvarnished, uncomfortable truth about what is known, what is unknown, and what is being assumed. They are owed transparency about risk, not probability distributions buried in technical papers. Clear-eyed acknowledgement, in plain language, of what the mission planners believe the actual chances of survival are, and what the chances of return are, and what the difference is between those two numbers and the numbers the public has been given. They are owed the best technology that can be developed before they depart. Not next year's technology, not the version that will be ready in a decade, but the technology that exists and has been tested at the time of launch. Whatever possibility of return can be kept open should be kept open. Whatever risk can be reduced should be reduced. Whatever uncertainty can be resolved before departure should be resolved, not deferred. And they are owed something that costs nothing, but that may be the hardest thing of all to provide. They are owed the promise that they will not be forgotten. Not as abstract pioneers, not as names on a plaque, not as characters in a story told to inspire the next generation. As specific human beings, with names, with families, with fears they never told anyone. With moments of doubt at 3 a.m. when the habitat was quiet and the pale blue dot was just barely visible through the porthole. With losses they accumulated one by one across years of exile. With laughter that echoed off metal walls. With love that survived the 20-minute delay. With grief that no ritual could contain. The first Martians deserve to be remembered as people, not as symbols, not as martyrs, not as data points in a mission report. As human beings who agreed to pay a price that most of us will never pay, for a future that most of us will never see. And now, we arrive at the question that has been waiting since the beginning, the question that has no answer and should not have one, because resolution would be false. Is this worth it? Return to the Cheava Falls Rock, that leopard-spotted stone in Jezero crater, holding what may be the fingerprint of ancient Martian life. The most important scientific sample in human history, sitting in a sealed tube on the surface of Mars, waiting for a return mission that has not been funded. We may be about to contaminate a world that holds the answer to our deepest question, before we have had the courage to bring the sample home and look. Return to the delay. February 9th, 2026. The Mars mission shelved. The 2026 window closed. The timeline slipping again, not because the dream is fading, but because the physics is stubborn, and the engineering is hard, and the gap between ambition and reality keeps refusing to close. Every version of the future arrives later than promised. Return to the volunteers, hundreds of thousands of them, hands raised, willing, knowing the risks, at least in the abstract, and saying yes anyway. Because something in the human spirit responds to the beyond. Because something in us has always needed to know what lies on the other side. Because staying safe has never been the thing that defined us. Return to the children, the ones who will be born on Mars if a colony survives long enough. The ones who will develop in 38% gravity under a radiation flux we have never tested on a developing human body, inside a habitat they did not choose, on a world they cannot leave. The ones who will look at the pale blue dot and know that it is home, in some ancestral sense, without ever understanding what that word means in the way their parents understood it. We are, for the first time in the history of our species, seriously planning to send human beings to live and die permanently on another world. The technology is not ready. The ethics have not been resolved. The governance has not been established. The science that might change everything about what we think we know about Mars has not been completed. And yet the planning continues. The rockets are being built. The volunteers are waiting. The window is always opening and closing. What we think about this matters. What we feel about it matters, not because our feelings will change the physics, but because the decisions being made right now, in this decade, will determine whether human beings live or die on another planet within our lifetimes. And those decisions are being made, right now, by a very small number of people, for a very large number of people, with very little public conversation about what is actually at stake. The question is not whether humans will go to Mars. Eventually, we probably will. The question is whether we go with our eyes open, whether we go honestly, whether we name the costs before we pay them, whether we remember the people we send as people, not as missions, whether we look at the pale blue dot from both directions, from Earth looking out and from Mars looking back, and understand that the space between those two points of view contains everything that makes us human. The distance, the silence, the irreversibility, the loss, and the stubborn, irrational, magnificent refusal to stop reaching. Somewhere tonight, on Earth, someone is looking up at the sky. They can see Mars, a faint red point among the stars, and they are thinking about going there. They are imagining what it would feel like to stand on that world and look back. They do not fully understand what it would cost them. Nobody can, until they are standing there. But they want to go anyway. And somewhere in the future,